Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into the early years of Steve Jobs. We're using Walter Isaacson's biography as our guide here.
Right. And the idea is to figure out what really shaped him. What were the key experiences, the influences that led to his, well, unique way of looking at tech and innovation.
Exactly. We've got quite a bit to cover.
Yeah, we do.
Uh-huh.
Stuff like his adoption, growing up in what became Silicon Valley, his early playing around with electronics, music too.
Uh-huh.
Then there's college, which was brief.
Very brief.
His trip to India, which seems pretty formative. Early ventures like the Blue Box, Atari. Then obviously the start of Apple and getting the Macintosh rolling.
So for you listening, this is really a chance to get a concentrated look at sort of the building blocks of Jobs' personality and his vision.
We'll try to pull out some surprising things, those moments that really seem to, set him on his path.
Okay, let's dive in, starting right at the beginning. The adoption. The details there are quite specific.
They really are. His birth mother insisting the adoptive parents had to be college graduates. That's pretty unusual, isn't it?
It is. And then the first couple, they wanted a girl.
Yeah, so that fell through.
Right.
And that's how Paul and Clara Jobs ended up adopting him. Kind of a twist of fate right there.
Makes you think, what if? But Jobs himself, he was always really clear about Paul and Clara, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Unequivocal. He called them his 1,000% parents. That's the quote.
1,000%.
Yeah. And his biological parents, he's pretty detached about them. Almost like, a sperm and egg bank, just the biological origin.
Wow, that's blunt.
It is, but it shows how strongly he identified with Paul and Clara.
So does Isaacson, or do you think that whole experience being given up but then chosen, did that feed into his later feelings, like feeling special or needing control maybe?
It's definitely something Isaacson explores. That sense of being abandoned but also chosen could, foster a feeling of being different, maybe outside the normal rules, possibly contributing to that independence or even that intensity he had later on.
Interesting connection. Okay, so moving into his childhood in Mountain View. Sounds pretty standard for the late 50s initially.
Yeah, typical suburban Silicon Valley childhood in many ways.
Yeah.
But his father, Paul, seems like a really key figure.
His background was mechanics, right? A repo man.
That's right. He wasn't an engineer, but he loved working with his hands, fixing cars, that kind of thing. And he really tried to pass that on to Steve.
The workbench in the garage.
Exactly. Setting up that workbench, teaching him about tools, about craftsmanship. Isaacson highlights this idea that Paul believed in doing the backs of cabinets and fences just as well as the fronts.
The unseen details matter.
Precisely. That focus on quality, even where it doesn't show.
Yeah.
Building that fence together, it seems like a small thing, but learning to handle tools, understanding how things are put together properly, maybe that planted a seed.
Yeah, that sense of craft. It wasn't just mechanics, though. His curiosity went digital or electronic pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah. And a bit mischievous, too.
The house wiring story.
Right. Wiring the house with speakers, microphone in his closet, basically building a little listening station to spy on his parents' bedroom.
Huh. Teenage spy. How did his dad react?
Well, Paul seemed impressed by the technical skill, but apparently told him to take it down pretty sharpish. An early lesson in boundaries, perhaps.
Maybe. But the spark was there. And the neighbor, Larry Lang.
Yeah, an engineer. He seems to have really encouraged Steve's interest, showed him a carbon microphone, explained how it worked. And then there were the Heath kits.
Right, Heath kits. Explain those for anyone who doesn't know. They were a big deal, weren't they?
Huge deal for hobbyists back then. Basically do-it-yourself electronic kits. You could build radios, TVs, amplifiers.
So you got all the parts and instructions.
Exactly. But the key thing was, the manuals didn't just say put tab A into slot B. They explained the why. The underlying electronics principles.
So you were actually learning, not just assembling.
Precisely. And Jobs credited that experience hugely. He said it made him feel like he could understand and build anything. That feeling that technology wasn't some mysterious black box.
That's powerful, giving him that sense of agency, like, I can make this stuff.
Absolutely. And that confidence, you can see how that would carry through.
Okay, alongside the electronics, there was music. A big connection point with Wozniak.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
A shared passion. Job talked about it being this incredible time for music, like living through Mozart's era or something. Maybe a bit dramatic, but
He had a flair for the dramatic.
he did. And Wozniak was the one who really got him into Bob Dylan.
Dylan seems like a key influence mentioned in the book.
Yeah, the lyrics, the counterculture vibe, it resonated. They apparently became obsessed, hunting down Dylan bootleg tapes, subscribing to newsletters. It was a serious pursuit.
Shows that intensity applied to something other than tech early on.
Right. It's that focus again. And maybe that shared appreciation for artistry, whether in music or code.
And that enthusiasm, maybe combined with the Heathkit confidence, seems to lead into their first sort of venture, the blue box.
Ah, yes, the legendary blue box.
Yeah.
This is where Woze's technical genius really shines, and Jobs starts showing his knack for packaging and selling it.
So remind us, what did the blue box actually do?
It generated the tones that the phone system used back then to route long-distance calls. So essentially, you could make free calls anywhere in the world,
Uh-huh. Hack in the phone system.
pretty much. Wozniak tackled the challenge of making a digital version, which was harder. He designed it using parts from Radio Shack, incredibly clever circuit design.
And they needed help with the exact tones.
Yeah, they found a music student with perfect pitch to help them get the frequencies just right.
Resourceful. And the first test call.
Apparently, they called Wozniak's uncle in, I think, L.A. And it worked. Isaacson describes them being just incredibly excited, yelling about calling for free.
You can imagine the thrill. But it wasn't just about saving money, was it?
No, I think it was more about the power. Understanding a complex system, figuring out its rules, and then, well, bending them, using their smarts to beat the system.
A bit of that counterculture, anti-establishment vibe, maybe.
Definitely. And that feeling, wow, we figured this out, we built this thing and it works. That probably cemented their belief in what they could do together.
Okay, so after these early tech explorations, Jobs takes a pretty sharp turn. The trip to India, the spiritual quest.
Yeah, a really significant detour, or maybe not a detour. It seems deeply woven into who he became. This wasn't just backpacking. It was a serious immersion in Eastern spirituality, Zen Buddhism especially.
Daniel Kotka went with him, right?
He did. And Kotka said Steve became very much Zen. You can see traces of that later, can't you? The minimalist design aesthetic, that intense focus.
Simplicity, intuition.
Exactly. Isaacson connects it directly to his emphasis on intuition over sort of purely rational abstract thinking, valuing direct experience.
And his time with Robert Friedland and the Commune. All one farm.
Right. Friedland was this charismatic figure who seemed deeply involved in the spiritual scene, talking about enlightenment. Jobs was apparently quite taken with him initially. The whole commune experience, living simply, the Hare Krishna meals. It was a total immersion.
But he didn't stick with Friedland, did he? Seems like he got disillusioned.
Yeah, according to the book, Jobs saw Friedland shift from this supposedly enlightened guru figure to someone more focused on, well, money and influence, using spirituality for gain.
Ah.
And that seemed to really sour Jobs. Maybe it sharpened his sense of authenticity, or perhaps his tendency to see things in black and white people were either enlightened or they were phonies.
Okay, so he comes back from India,
Oh.
changed. Then there's Reed College, which didn't last long.
No, not at all. He dropped out pretty quickly. He found the required classes boring, but famously audited classes that did interest him.
Like calligraphy.
Exactly. And dance, apparently. It just highlights that he wasn't going to follow a path just because it was laid out for him. If it didn't grab him, he wasn't interested.
Yeah. A real contrast to Wozniak, who seemed more willing to just, do the work needed for his degree.
Right. Was more pragmatic about the academic hoops. Jobs was driven purely by his own curiosity and passion. If a required course didn't feed that, he just wouldn't do it.
That self-direction is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Okay, after Reed, he ends up at Atari. Another key step.
Definitely. Atari was buzzing then, the heart of the early video game boom. And Jobs, despite apparently being a bit difficult to work with,
Shocker. Yeah.
right, he managed to charm the founder, Nolan Bushnell. They had these philosophical chats, apparently, about free will and determinism.
Really? At Atari?
Yeah. And Jobs was already talking about his belief that you could sort of bend reality to your will if you just pushed hard enough.
Hmm?
That reality distortion field starting to emerge, maybe.
Possibly. And he did actual work there, too.
Oh, yeah. Famously worked on reducing the chip count for the game breakout, though there's some controversy about how much credit he took versus Wozniak's help.
Mhm.
But he also seemed to absorb Atari's focus on simplicity in game design, making things intuitive.
And he met Ron Wayne there, too.
Right. Wayne had already tried starting a company and, well, it hadn't gone well financially. He'd been burned.
So he had some real-world, maybe cautionary experience.
Exactly. Which might be why, when Jobs proposed, they start a slot machine business together.
A slot machine business.
Yeah, that was an early idea. Wayne turned him down. He apparently told Jobs he had a burning drive, but that the business world could be rough. A telling interaction.
Wayne saw the intensity early on. Okay, so after Atari, back to India for a bit, or connecting back to that experience.
Well, the book revisits the India trip when talking about his return. There's the story of him being generous to Kotke when their stuff got stolen.
Shows a different side, maybe.
Perhaps.
Mm.
But also, he barely contacted his parents for 7 months where he was gone.
Hmm.
Suggests that intense focus on his own journey, maybe a detachment from conventional ties.
And the return itself was dramatic, right?
Visually, yes. Shaved head, Indian robes. Apparently, his parents walked right past him at the airport, didn't recognize him at first.
Wow. A real transformation inside and out.
It seems so. He also mentioned learning something there from an engineer about projecting confidence, acting like you're in control, even if you're not sure. Another hint of his later style.
Okay, this feels like it's all converging now. The tech, the counterculture, the experiences leading to the homebrew computer club and the birth of Apple.
Exactly. The early 70s in the Bay Area was this unique moment. You had the tech revolution bubbling up, but also the fallout of the 60s counterculture, self-fulfillment movements, anti-authoritarian
A
vibe.
real melting pot.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the Homebrew Computer Club was ground zero for the personal computer hobbyists. People sharing designs, showing off what they'd built, debating the future. It was chaotic, but vibrant.
Wozniak was a regular, right? And he dragged Jobs along.
Pretty much. Woz was deep in the technical side, building his early computer board. Jobs initially might have just tagged along, but he quickly saw something else.
The potential, beyond just a hobby.
Yeah, the potential for a product. He saw Woz's brilliant design and started thinking about how to turn it into something people could actually buy and use. And he was already hustling the story of him getting free DRAM chips from Intel just by kind of talking his way into it.
Shows that early salesmanship or reality distortion.
Right. And the vibe of the club, figures like Lee Felsenstein, who really saw computers as tools for empowerment for the people.
Yeah.
That probably resonated with the counterculture side of Jobs, too.
So the idea for Apple starts to form. But getting Wozniak on board wasn't straightforward. He liked his job at HP.
He really did. Was loyal to Hewlett-Packard, felt comfortable there. He wasn't initially keen on risking everything for a startup.
So how did Jobs convince him?
He brought in Ron Wayne again.
Wait.
Wayne, with his sort of seen-it-all perspective, apparently made the case to Woz that having a brilliant design wasn't enough. You needed someone to market it, to sell it, that a great engineer needed a great hustler, basically.
And that convinced Woz.
It seems to have been a key factor. And Wayne himself got brought in, famously getting a 10% stake, partly as a tiebreaker between Jobs and Wozniak if they disagreed.
Foreshadowing, perhaps? Though Wayne didn't stick around long.
No, he got nervous about the financial liability and sold his stake back very early on. Famously missed out on billions.
Ouch. Okay, so they have the partnership, but they need capital structure.
Yeah.
Enter Mike Markula.
Yeah, Markula was crucial. He was an early Intel guy who'd made his money from stock options and retired young. He had the business experience and the cash they desperately needed.
And he arrived in style, didn't he?
The gold Corvette, yeah, quite an entrance. But he immediately saw the potential in the Apple II prototype Woz and Jobs showed him. He wasn't just investing money, he really helped shape the company.
Like a mentor figure, especially for Jobs.
Very much so, according to Isaacson.
Yeah.
Taught Jobs about marketing, branding, sales, how to actually run a business. Markula emphasized building a company with values, focusing on the product, not just getting rich. Some of that seemed to stick, at least for a while.
But even with Markula providing some adult supervision, conflicts started brewing pretty early on, didn't they? Especially between Jobs and Mike Scott, the first president Markula brought in.
Oh yeah, big time. It was almost inevitable, really. You had Jobs, obsessed with product perfection down to the smallest detail, and Scott, who was hired to bring discipline and, actually ship things on budget.
So pragmatism versus perfectionism.
Exactly. The book details clashes over everything. The exact shade of beige for the Apple II case,
Seriously.
apparently. Jobs was adamant. Also, the color of the workbenches for the engineers. Tiny details, but symbolic of Jobs' unwillingness to compromise his aesthetic vision, even slightly.
And the warranty argument.
Right. Standard was 90 days. Jobs insisted on a full year for the Apple II. Huge confidence in the product, but also a big financial risk, and another source of friction with Scott and the more business-minded folks.
And how are things between Jobs and Wozniak at this point, philosophically?
Differences were emerging there, too. Woz wanted Apple to feel like a fun, engineering-driven, almost family place. Jobs was much more intense, demanding, focused on results. Isaacson mentions Jobs getting frustrated with Woz for not focusing enough on the software they needed, seeing him as maybe a bit immature or unfocused.
So the seeds of later tensions were already there.
Definitely. Despite all this, though, the Apple II was a massive hit.
Huge. But it was mostly seen as Woz's creation, wasn't it, technically?
Largely, yes. Wozniak's engineering genius was the heart of it, and according to Isaacson, that might have actually spurred Jobs on.
How so?
It fueled his desire to create his breakthrough product, something that was undeniably Steve Jobs' vision, from concept to completion, which leads us towards the Macintosh.
But first, the visit to Xerox Paris. This feels like mythology now, but it was real.
Absolutely real and absolutely pivotal. Xerox Paris' the Palo Alto Research Center was doing incredibly advanced stuff, way ahead of its time, thinking about the future of the office, user interfaces.
They basically invented a lot of what we use today, right?
Things like the graphical user interface, GUI, the mouse, network computing, laser printing. Alan Kay was there with his ideas about the Dynabook, a sort of proto-laptop, and his famous line, "The best way to predict the future is to invent it."
Which Jobs must have loved.
Totally. So Xerox had all this amazing tech, but they weren't quite sure how to commercialize it for the mainstream.
And Jobs saw it.
And he got it instantly. He arranged a deal where Apple could invest in Xerox, and in return, Jobs and some Apple engineers got a couple of demos of the PRC technology.
What did they show him?
The GUI, the windows, the mouse pointing device, object-oriented programming, the whole concept of a visual, intuitive way to interact with a computer.
And his reaction.
Apparently, he was just blown away, pacing around, incredibly excited. He immediately saw this was the future, not the command lines everyone else was using. Adele Goldberg at Xerox apparently tried to warn her bosses they were giving away the keys to the kingdom.
But Xerox didn't fully grasp what they had or what Jobs would do with it.
Seems not. Jobs saw the path to a mass-market product, using these ideas in a way Xerox hadn't conceived.
So he takes this vision back to Apple, and it starts to pour into the Macintosh project, which wasn't originally his project.
No, it started as a simpler appliance-like computer project led by Jeff Raskin, initially called Annie, then renamed Macintosh after Raskin's favorite apple.
But Jobs took it over.
He did, with his characteristic intensity. He basically commandeered the project and reshaped it around the Payoric vision, making it much more ambitious. His recruitment style was legendary even then.
How so?
Passionate, almost evangelical. He'd show potential team members the prototype, paint this grand vision of changing the world, make them feel like they were joining a rebellion, building something insanely great.
Pulling people in with sheer force of will, like Andy Hertzfeld.
Right. Hertzfeld was working on the Apple II. Jobs basically walked over, told him he was now working on Macintosh, unplugged his Apple II computer, drove him over to the Mac building, and that was that. Abrupt, but effective.
Wow. No discussion.
Not much.
Yeah.
And they even briefly considered calling the machine Bicycle.
Bicycle. Glad they stuck with Macintosh.
Me too. Though the Apple theme continued.
It's during the Mac development that the reality distortion field really becomes a thing, right? We touched on it, but what did it mean in practice?
It was the term the team used for Jobs' ability to convince anyone, including himself, of almost anything. He could set completely unrealistic deadlines or technical goals, and through sheer charisma, conviction, willpower, somehow make people believe they were possible. And often they'd actually achieve them.
So it could be motivating.
Hugely motivating, like a Jedi mind trick, people said. Wozniak compared it to having this illogical vision that Jobs somehow willed into reality. But it could also be manipulative, used to push people beyond reasonable limits, to ignore obstacles, sometimes to rewrite history a bit. Bud Tribble on the Mac team likened it to Rasputin's influence.
Hypnotic. Powerful, but potentially dangerous.
Exactly. A double-edged sword, definitely. And it was tied into his absolute perfectionism.
He just couldn't compromise, could he?
Seemed physically incapable of it sometimes. Isaacson describes his visceral disdain for anything he considered subpar, or for people he saw as bozos who settled for mediocrity.
The Osborne 1 computer story.
Perfect example. The Osborne was clunky but practical, the first portable success. Its creator's philosophy was adequacy is sufficient. Jobs apparently found that whole idea just offensive. For him, it had to be insanely great or it was garbage.
Which must have made him a tough boss.
Understatement. Demanding, critical, often brutally blunt. Accounts are full of him tearing into people's work, sometimes publicly.
Yet people stayed. They built the Mac.
Many did, because alongside the harshness, there was the vision, the charisma, the feeling of being part of something historic. He pushed them incredibly hard, but often got incredible results. It's that contradiction again.
And that perfectionism wasn't just about the code, it was hugely about the design, the look and feel.
Oh, absolutely central. From very early on. Growing up seeing the clean lines of Eichler homes in California, his father's interest in car design. It instilled this deep appreciation for industrial design.
He saw it as a key differentiator for Apple.
Totally. He believed great design wasn't just surface gloss. It communicated the quality and thinking behind the product, made it easier and more pleasurable to use. He obsessed over the visual interface on the screen.
The rounded rectangles story.
Classic example. Bill Atkinson developed an amazing quick-draw routine for rectangles on the screen, but they had sharp corners. Jobs insisted they needed to be rounded like real-world objects. Atkinson said it was mathematically difficult. Jobs just stared at him and said, basically, you can do it.
Reality distortion field again.
Maybe. Atkinson went back and figured out a brilliant way to do rounded rectangles efficiently. Jobs just wouldn't take no for an answer when it came to his aesthetic vision.
And the calculator design.
Another great story. Designer Chris Espinosa mocked up calculators. Jobs hated them all. He wanted something specific. So Espinosa, frustrated, built a tool, the Steve Jobs roll-your-own calculator construction set, that let Jobs himself play with button sizes, fonts, layouts, until he got exactly what he wanted.
Huh. Turning the table slightly.
It shows Jobs' deep, hands-on involvement. He later collaborated with Hartmut Esslinger on the Snow White design language for Apple products. Esslinger's motto, "Form follows emotion," really clicked with Jobs.
So, intense focus on design, intense focus on perfection, but eventually you have to ship. The real artist ship idea.
Right. That became a mantra, especially as the Macintosh project dragged on. It represented a necessary shift, maybe a slight tempering of the absolute perfectionism. You still aim for insanely great, but you can't tinker forever. You have to get it out the door.
There was an incident related to this at a retreat.
Yeah, January 1983. Bill Atkinson apparently suggested holding the Mac back a bit longer for more polishing. Jobs reportedly got quite upset, invoking the real artist's ship line. It showed that tension. The artist wanting perfection, the leader needing to deliver.
So the Mac is getting closer, but Apple is growing, becoming more complex. Jobs starts to realize he needs help running the company.
He did, and Markkula agreed. Jobs was brilliant at product vision, but managing a large organization wasn't necessarily his strength, especially the day-to-day operational stuff.
They first tried to recruit Don Estridge from IBM.
Yeah, Estridge had successfully launched the IBM PC,
Yeah.
a huge competitor. Getting him would have been a coup. They courted him, but he ultimately turned them down.
Why?
Loyalty to IBM was part of it. But Isaacson suggests Estridge might also have been a bit put off by Jobs' intensity and some of the unconventional stories Jobs told during the recruitment.
Okay, so Plan B, John Scully from PepsiCo.
Right. A very different background. Marketing genius, famous for the Pepsi Challenge, very polished corporate executive.
Why him? Seems an odd fit for Apple.
Markkula and the board wanted serious experience management. And Jobs apparently became convinced Scully was the one who could take Apple to the next level. He really turned on the charm, the reality distortion field.
The famous line.
Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Hard to resist that pitch.
Yeah, that's compelling. Scully was hesitant, though.
Initially, yes. The computer industries seemed volatile, unstructured compared to PepsiCo. But Jobs kept wooing him, flying him out, showing him the Mac prototypes, painting the grand vision. Scully was impressed by Jobs' passion, his perfectionism, like insisting on specific oak for doors in his house.
But the honeymoon didn't last forever, right? Friction started.
Pretty quickly. Their styles were just so different. Scully was consensus-driven, corporate. Jobs was intuitive, demanding, often rode roughshod over people, including Scully sometimes. Scully apparently tried to coach Jobs on being less abrasive, more mindful of others.
How did that go?
About as well as you'd expect. Jobs wasn't really coachable in that way. The underlying tension between their personalities and approaches just kept growing.
Despite that tension, the Macintosh launch itself was huge, driven by that 1984 ad.
Oh, the ad was a sensation. Directed by Ridley Scott, aired during the Super Bowl. It didn't even show the computer, just this dystopian imagery, a lone heroine smashing the Big Brother screen. The message was clear: Apple Macintosh, the rebellion against IBM's conformity.
Why 1984 won't be like 1984? Genius tagline.
Absolutely. It created incredible buzz, became a news event in itself, unprecedented for an ad back then.
And Jobs knew how to capitalize on that buzz for the actual launch event.
He's a master showman. The shareholders meeting unveiling, it was pure theater. pulling the Mac from a bag, having it speak.
It spoke.
Yeah, using an early text-to-speech synthesizer. The audience went wild. Standing ovation for 5 minutes, pandemonium. He knew how to create a moment.
And he rewarded the team.
He gave them each a personalized Mac, engraved with their signatures inside the case, acknowledging their heroic effort even after driving them relentlessly.
Yeah.
But then, when asked about market
You
research,
dismissed it?
completely. Famously asked if Alexander Graham Bell did market research before inventing the telephone. Pure Jobs, confidence, or arrogance, depending on your view. Believing his intuition trumped data.
During this time, what was the relationship like with Bill Gates and Microsoft? They were crucial for Mac software.
Crucial and complex. Gates and Jobs were fascinated by each other, I think. Maybe a bit envious, too. Gates admired Jobs' charisma and product sense, but thought Apple's business model was flawed.
And Jobs' view of Gates.
Often dismissive.
True.
Called him unimaginative, said he had no taste.
Yeah.
But he needed Microsoft software, like Excel and Word, for the Mac to succeed.
So they had to work together.
Yeah. Early on, Jobs showed Gates the Mac prototypes, trying to enlist Microsoft in his dream factory. Microsoft developed software for it under the internal code name Sand. But there was always this underlying rivalry and philosophical difference. Gates focused on software dominance, Jobs on integrated hardware and software.
Okay, so the Mac launches to huge fanfare, but sales maybe weren't explosive immediately, and the tension with Scully boils over.
Right. The Mac was revolutionary, but expensive, and lacked enough software initially. Sales didn't meet the incredibly high expectations. This exacerbated the friction between Jobs and Scully over strategy, pricing, everything.
And Jobs' behavior became erratic.
According to Isaacson and others, yes. He'd apparently try to undermine Scully, rally support against him, then maybe swing back to expressing loyalty. It created instability.
Until Scully felt he had to force the issue.
Exactly. He went to the board and basically said, it's him or me. He laid out the case that Jobs' management style and interference were harming the company.
And the board. Mercola, Arthur Rock.
They backed Scully unanimously. They removed Jobs from operational control of the Macintosh division, effectively stripping him of power.
How did Jobs take it?
Devastated. Utterly betrayed. He couldn't comprehend how the company he co-founded, the people he'd brought in, could do this to him. He reportedly talked to Del Yocam, saying he felt like he'd been punched in the stomach.
A brutal end to his first run at Apple.
Incredibly brutal. Scully reorganized, giving Jobs a nominal role as chairman, but with no real power, no team. Just an office.
What was he like in that period?
Lost, apparently. Playing Bob Dylan tapes loudly. Feeling abandoned, especially by Scully, who he'd personally recruited, and by Markula and Rock, who had been early supporters and father figures.
But he didn't just fade away, he started NXT.
Right, he wasn't going to sit on the sidelines. He went back to the Apple board, told them he was starting a new company aimed at the higher education market.
How did they react?
He tried to frame it as non-competitive, promising to take only a few junior people, not key players. He offered to resign as chairman, but maybe hoped Apple would invest or partner somehow.
Did they see it that way?
Not entirely. There was immediate suspicion he'd compete directly and poach talent. The relationship soured very quickly.
And Wozniak weighed in publicly around this time.
Yeah, prompted partly by Scully, Wozniak gave some interviews that were quite critical of Jobs' integrity. He mentioned past incidents, like allegedly blocking a design firm was liked, and basically said he couldn't trust Jobs.
Ouch. Coming from Woz, that must have stung.
Definitely added salt to the wound, showed how deep the fractures had become, even with his original partner.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this major chapter, his first act at Apple. Stepping back from it all, what are the main takeaways from these formative years?
Well, you really see the strands coming together, don't you? The technical curiosity sparked by his dad and Heathkits, the counterculture influence, the intensity, the aesthetic sense sharpened by Zen and calligraphy, the early entrepreneurial drive with the blue box.
Yeah.
It all feeds into the Apple story.
It's this unique blend.
Exactly. Curiosity, intensity, artistry, a bit of rebellion, and that relentless perfectionism. It was all there pretty early on, just waiting for the right outlet.
Is there one surprising fact or detail from this whole period that really sticks with you?
Maybe the blue box story still. Just the sheer audacity of it. Two young guys, basically kids, taking on the global phone system with parts from Radio Shack. It captures that mix of technical brilliance and kind of playful defiance that seems so core to their early success. A reminder that innovation can come from unexpected, even slightly illicit places.
That's a good one. And for you listening, thinking about your own work or learning, what's the connection here?
I think it's about how diverse experiences can fuel creativity. Jobs wasn't just a tech guy. He was into design, music, spirituality. Seemingly unrelated things came together to shape his unique vision. So maybe the lesson is, follow your varied interests, don't feel you have to stay in one lane. You never know how they might connect down the road.
Challenge those boundaries. Okay, finally, leave us with a provocative thought based on all this.
Right. Think about that tension between Jobs' unwavering, often uncompromising vision and the need for collaboration. His intensity drove amazing innovation, no doubt, but it also burned bridges and caused immense conflict. So the question to ponder is, how much compromise is necessary? When does sticking to your vision become destructive? Where's that line between visionary leadership and, well, just being impossible to work with? It's a balance that plays out everywhere, not just in tech.